He glances down at his own feet, and there he sees a curled up fetus with its umbilical cord still attached. He picks the fetus up and is still breathing. The soldiers were killing these fetuses. So many questions arises. Why are they killing these fetuses? What are fetuses doing in the ruins of this town? He holds the fetus close to him out of instinct, as if to protect it. In that instant, the fetus begins to suck on his thumb. It feels mushy and gross. It sucks with all its might. He pulls, but it wouldn't come off. He tries swinging it around. Still no luck. He tries to pry its mouth open, but it still refuses to let go. Of course, no milk would come out of his hand, and it didn't feel like it was sucking his blood, but he feels the distinct sensation that little by little, there was something being sucked out. This is when he notices a soldier heading towards him. He runs, not trying to protect the child, but because he feels like he is in danger. I should explain how we got here. The child was a 1,500 gram preemie. It was a boy. Immediately after birth, he was taken from my wife and put into an incubator. My wife went half mad, screaming and crying. They hooked her up to an IV drip and gave her a tranquilizer to calm her, but she kept crying. After a few weeks, my wife was finally allowed to hold the baby, and at that moment, time stopped for her. The baby stopped maturing. He got bigger, but his appearance was still that of a newborn baby and showed no signs of changing. My wife didn't find it strange at all, and just accepted this reality. He's still just a tiny baby, she said, and didn't bother to give him a name. I just chose something random for his birth records. Weeks passed, then months, and then 2 years. My wife still lovingly breastfed that creature that was almost 10 kilograms and looked like nothing more than a deformed monkey. It's not as if I just stood there, with my arms folded and did nothing. This child is ill, or at the very least has some sort of syndrome, so we should take him to a doctor or a specialist to get checked out, I urged her many times. My wife stubbornly rejected my pleas, and stared at me as if I were the devil. My wife showed no sexual desire. Animals don't mate while they're nursing. It was the same for her. One night, I tried to make love to her. She frantically pushed me away. Her chest was exposed. Her breasts were covered in veins, and her swollen nipples dark and moist. Seeing them, I lost my erection. That's what they call rape. After uttering those words, my wife never spoke to me again. The baby woke and cried once every 2 hours. Each time he cried, my wife nursed him and changed his diaper. The rhythm of her daily life adapted to this pattern, and she didn't seem particularly bothered by it. But the same couldn't be said for me. I had a job. Spending the night like that with my wife, who wouldn't speak to me and clearly bore me ill will, was agony. Thankfully, before the baby was born, I'd bought a house that we couldn't really afford, and we were able to sleep separately, my wife and child in the nursery downstairs and myself upstairs. One Sunday afternoon, I returned home with a week's worth of groceries. My wife never set foot out of the house. Aside from housework, all she ever did was look after the baby. When I got home, they were both fast asleep in the nursery. There's usually nothing cuter than a 2-year-old, yet the strange creature that was breathing shallowly in bed had wispy hair, swollen eyelids and reddish skin. I was exhausted and at the end of my rope. How many more years must I live with this giant infant and this madwoman? I brought my hand to the child's throat. He cracked open his eyes. I suddenly came to my senses and raced out of the room and up the stairs. And then I collapsed at my desk and wept. So in the next chapter, the main character wakes up to a piercing silence. He wants to check the time, but the clock that had worked completely fine for years had just stopped. He feels a sense of uneasiness as he pulls back the curtain, and that's when he realizes that the earth has completely scorched. He runs outside in his pajamas, but he isn't hallucinating. His house is all that is left. There is nothing but wasteland all around him, as far as the eye can see. He stands there in shock. The first thing which comes into his mind is that this was a war. For some reason, he is certain. It had finally begun. And what a war it was. There wasn't a single corpse left behind, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. It would have been the worst war for mankind. Just as he is about to go back home, he sees a squad of soldiers marching towards his direction. They stop their march and spread out. It looks like they are looking for something. When neither one of them found what they were looking for, they poked the ground with their muskets. What came out was the sound of a newborn baby's cry. He couldn't imagine what these soldiers were doing. He glances down at his own feet, and there he sees a curled up fetus with its umbilical cord still attached. Kyuusai No Hi, or in English, The Day of Salvation, is another manga I have barely heard anyone talk about. Currently on my anime list, there are exactly 0 reviews. Hopefully this video changes it. It only has 11 chapters, so you can easily finish it in a single reading session. It was serialized in 2006 and was created by Nishioka Kyoudai, who are the same authors who brought to us The Journey to the End of the World, a title which I covered in my previous video. Just like Journey to the End, Day of Salvation follows Nishioka Kyoudai's trademark surrealist style. However, in my personal preference, I enjoyed Day of Salvation a lot more, because it has a little bit more of a linear plot progression. I say this very loosely as the story is just as equally, if not more bizarre, as the main character jumps around from one illogical scenario to the next illogical scenario. But the big difference is that our nameless main character actually has a goal in his mind, to find his family, and he is just as confused as the reader as he goes through his wacky and crazy journey. In the same vein as Nishioka Kyoudai's other titles, the story includes the unique signature artwork these authors are now famous for. Again, hardly any characters have facial features at all, and this is something directly brought up by the main character himself. In fact, there is just one other important character who we do see the face of, but I will get to talking about him later on in the video. The story doesn't even feel like a manga, as the plot flows almost like a western picture book. Each scene and chapter has a distinct, separate premise from the previous and following scene. As the main character continues his journey, he goes to his wife's parents' house, gets arrested and thrown into a strange preschool-like prison, then he soon finds himself in a psych ward where he is encouraged to keep smoking cigarettes. There are even 2 chapters which don't even fit in with the rest of the story in any way. There is one chapter based on the famous Pied Piper folklore, but instead of the piper using an instrument to lure kids, the main character always holds this strange candle, which apparently never extinguishes. When he lures the kids by performing acts and magic tricks, he indoctrinates them about the harshness and the way we need to prevent war and hate. In another chapter, we follow a man who probably isn't the same person as the main character in the rest of the story, on his way to take his daughter to the zoo. The village they are walking through is infested with stray cats, and the man starts to wonder whether there even is a zoo in this village. He then sees a sign which points towards a path of planks balancing on top of a series of abandoned boats. With no other choice, the man carefully goes on the path, holding his daughter's hand very tightly. He eventually sees an abandoned ferry with the name Zoo marked across it. It must have been some foolish attempt to boost the dying town's economy. The man regretted coming, but he still decided to see what it was like. He paid a ridiculously high entrance fee to get in, and after he went down into the dark stairway, they are surprised at what they see. What used to be the dining floor is filled with a bunch of broken crane games. Inside them, there are nothing but cats. They weren't even exotic or special cats either, just plain cats which they might as well have seen when they were walking around in the village. While Journey to the End felt more like a story about the main character's personal problems, Day of Salvation includes a clear social critique for its narrative. For example, the idea and problems of capitalism is represented multiple times as the main character continues to search for his wife and child. There is one particular scene where the main character goes back to his workplace to speak to his boss. As his boss screams about how the stocks are rising, the main character looks out the window, and he sees a giant warehouse where piles of corpses were being lined up like tuna in a fish market. When the boss finally notices his presence, he yells at him for still being in his pajamas and says that he has to go back to work because everything is about profit. Our character pleads to him that he can't do anything with the fetus sucking on his finger, and that he wants the day off of work so that he can look for his family. But without hesitation, the boss immediately fires him. Having no other options, our character turns around to head back home, but he is enveloped by the fear that his wife and child might be somewhere in the pile of corpses, so he races down to the warehouse to look for them. However, as he does so, a man in a military uniform appeared behind a podium and began to speak. It was apparently the company president. He then gives a short speech about how capitalism has won, that they are now in the age of pure capital, pure profit, pure trade. There was scattered applause. "You fucking vulture," the main character thought to himself. In a different scene, our main character is in prison, and he meets another prisoner who claims he is a communist. Our main character says that he is the first person he's seen with a face since the war had started. The pair follow to have a very deep conversation about human nature and the cause of the war. This is one of the deepest and thought-provoking chapters in this whole story, so I will not spoil anything here. This leads to the most important moral of the story, regarding atrocities and the need to abolish war. I particularly love the way Day of Salvation represents this, because it's so different to how other mediums do it, including manga and anime. We all know at least a dozen stories which pushes this anti-war message through visual violence and empathy, but in contrast, Day of Salvation hardly includes this type of motif at all. I will leave this for you to find out for yourself when you read this title. This is even something directly stated by the authors themselves. In the afterword, one of the authors says a very deep line. "I prefer peace that is badly written and full of contradictions to war that is beautiful and consistent." Every time I reread Day of Salvation, I get some new interpretation out of it. Just like Nishioka Kyoudai's other works, the art style and the story is all over the place, but it still feels gripping and powerful. Again, I fully understand that it's not for everyone, but I still reckon everyone should give this title a go.